It's a mighty long road that my poor hands have hoed. My poor feet have traveled a long dusty road. Out of your dust bowl and westward we rode. Your deserts was hot and your mountains was cold.
I'm Alejandra.
I'm Ana.
This is Latinx Mental Health Podcast, where we talk to therapists, researchers, artists, activists, and students about their experiences in the intersections of mental health and Latinx identity.
When did you come to America the free? Who are your ancestors? What is your creed?
This episode contains discussion of immigration detention, family separation, and recent disturbing images shared on social media. So keep that in mind while listening and take good care. Welcome to this special edition of the Latinx Mental Health Podcast. We have decided to come out of our summer break in light of the recent reaction to the border crisis. The actions of the federal government constitute a crime against humanity, and rightly so, people are horrified and outraged. There's also a sense of urgency accompanied by powerlessness, and people have been asking both of us what exactly it is they're supposed to do. As in any crisis, panic sets in and it can be difficult or nearly impossible to think clearly and strategically. We want to validate your feelings and the impulse to help. It is a normal response to inhumanity, and this is an all-hands-on-deck situation. You are needed, but it is important to take a step back and assess any situation before diving in.
We felt it was necessary to make this episode because we've both been watching this crisis unfold for years and feel we can offer an important perspective and tangible tools and ideas for getting involved. We also feel compelled to address the trauma being created by this crisis, not only to the immigrant families themselves, which will cause ripple effects of trauma and stress for generations, but also for the people involved in this work and the Latinx community who is being disproportionately targeted.
We also want to highlight that there are people who have been working on this issue for a long time, and now is the time to really listen to what they have to say. Anytime there's injustice, you can be sure that there has also been resistance, and resistance can take on many forms. Art, music, and literature have always played an important role in social movements, and in many ways serve as a sort of inheritance to present-day activists. We want to highlight that contribution by paying homage to the late, great Woody Guthrie, whose songs of resistance from the 30s and 40s remain salient as ever and continue to be played and reimagined by artists to this day. As it is the week of the 4th of July, we chose Pastures of Plenty and kicked off the episode with Lila Downs' version. We will be sprinkling in other variations throughout the episode. We take solace in Guthrie's refrain. Every state in this union us migrants have been, will work in this fight and will fight till we win. Right now might be a good time to take a deep breath.
Green pastures of plenty, from dry desert ground, from that grand Cooley Dam where the water runs down. Every state in this union us migrants have been. We'll work in this fight and we'll fight till we win. Well, it's always we ramble, that river and I, all along your green valley I'll work till I die. My land I'll defend with my life if it be, 'cause my pastures of plenty must always be free.
So I think there's been a lot of emotions in response to everything that's been happening. And we wanted to start by sharing some of our own emotional responses as a way of opening the conversation and also really centering that that's an important place to start. Mm-hmm. So I know for me, when all of the pieces around what happens in the news increases, that's something that really affects me, especially on social media, when I see pictures being shared, images, when it's something that hits so close to home. I know that I have to go through somewhat of a grief process before I can do anything else. And I think that's always really hard for me because my inclination is to want to go right into action. And I know myself well enough now to know that if I don't let the grief process happen first, that it's going to hit me at some point and probably stronger than ever. So I know for me, I spent at least 4 or 5 days when all this first started being more present on social media, literally not engaging and kind of feeling what I needed to feel, and really resourcing, like being around people that I really loved and listening to music that I really needed to. And then I had a moment I was listening to a podcast called Song Exploder and Hosier's Nina Cried Power song, and I just cried for like 30 minutes straight and it was beautiful. And that song is also really about activism and about taking a stand and how we can do that through art. And I knew after I did that, obviously, that I had space to grieve still, but I felt that I could get more into action mode, and that's when I started helping to plan the 4th of July rally and feeling like I had the brain space and energy for it. But if I hadn't been able to feel like I had released something before then, I don't think I would have gotten involved, and that would have been completely fine.
Yeah.
What was it like for you?
Yeah, I think for me, I've been involved in this work more or less for about 8 years now, and when I first started doing this work, I don't think I was well equipped enough to be doing it. And I did a lot of things that in hindsight contributed to burnout and secondary trauma. And so that's something that I'm much more aware of now in my response, because what happens for me when there's this increase of articles and images on social media is that I go completely numb. And I'm not sure that I've gotten out of that state of numbness yet. And I understand it. It's still kind of like, I find it still a little bit troubling because I haven't really been able to feel anything. And I think part of the mistake that I'm making currently is by engaging in too much social media and is by like clicking on things that I know I probably shouldn't be clicking on. And that there's this need, I think especially, well, no, I won't say especially by anybody, but I think there's this need to show really graphic images that I don't quite understand. Because for somebody who has PTSD or anybody whose community is impacted by something like this, seeing an image of a dead body is really triggering.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that's been coming out more and more, especially recently. And there's been a few really great posts, I think, on social media explaining why that's so harmful. I think one of them has been a recognition that oftentimes it's bodies of people of color that are shared when they are already dead, and not white bodies that are shared in that way, and that's a really stark distinction that people have seen on social media. And also just the idea of, what the purpose of that is, right? And I think the shock and trying to shock people into action piece oftentimes is most effective with people who are least directly impacted, and it's most hurtful to people that are most directly impacted. And so when I see that, it's hard for me. But if you have family that have been through a situation like that, it's even harder.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about this, but, we really shouldn't need to see dead bodies in order to care about an issue. It shouldn't have to be to that level.
Yeah, because that's the argument, right? That people need to see the atrocity to feel compelled to act, which isn't true.
Right.
In fact, I would say even for people who are not as affected, that it's counterproductive even for them, because of this numbness that happens when you're exposed to so many images. A way that you protect yourself is to go numb. I find it much more powerful when people share images of people when they were alive and when they were in their life, knowing that they can't be anymore.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think there's been really beautiful illustrations that have come out, and that takes us back to the conversation around art as well, that there's really beautiful ways to memorialize folks that doesn't need to involve seeing those dead bodies. And I think the way that we understand trauma as well is to know that those images can be triggering, but also those images in and of themselves can create a trauma response depending on the person seeing them. And the thing about social media is you don't have control over who's seeing things. And I think that's just a really important thing to be mindful of, especially given that it's definitely harder to be in mobilizing your energy mode and action mode when we're numb or when we're kind of paralyzed by everything we're seeing. And so the shock them into action, the way that we understand the nervous system and how our bodies react in mental health is actually an illogical concept.
Yeah. Can't shock anything into
No,
action.
That's not how that works.
Yeah.
So I think that's really, really important. So just like you were saying about numbness being protective, I think it's really important for all of us to know that the majority of our emotional and physical reactions are protective, because that's what our brains and bodies are trying to do all the time. They're trying to keep us alive. And so I think anyone who's listening, just know that however you have reacted to all of the things in the news, everything we've been hearing about, everything we've been seeing is a normal response. And I would bet anything that you are not the only one feeling the response that you're feeling. And it's really important to know that we're all unique individuals. And so, Alice and my responses have been different, and that's okay. And that's part of our own histories, and that's part of our own journeys, and that's part of our own stories. And so as we continue to respond, knowing that it's going to take us all different amounts of time to feel what we need to feel, and that's part of this process. And if we don't allow ourselves to sit in what we need to sit in, then it's going to come back tenfold down the line. And so as everyone thinks about how they would like to react, knowing that that's part of the process, and that you'll get to wherever piece of moving your energy you want to get to when it works for you and your body and what you need.
I agree with all of that completely, but I do think one emotion that we need to be really curious about is guilt.
Yes.
Because I've felt it. I'm sure you've felt some of that guilt, and I hear it from everybody. Like, you feel guilty for not giving enough of yourself.
Totally.
And it's understandable, but it isn't particularly helpful.
And I think it's important when you say curious, I love that, because I think the curiosity is, where is this coming from, right? And I think there's a lot of pieces. It could be coming from a sense of privilege. It could be coming from a sense of helplessness or hopelessness. And it could be coming from a sense of really not validating your own reactions and letting yourself take that time, right? I know that I kept having to pull myself away from feeling guilt when I wasn't responding those first few days, and I was allowing myself to disconnect, and it felt like it was not an okay thing to do. And I kept having to remind myself, you're feeling this way because a lot of other folks are reacting, and maybe that's what they need, right? But again, what do I need? And I need a minute, right? And so I think, depending on where it's coming from, then we need to respond. So if it's coming from a place of privilege, then it's like, let's examine that privilege. Let's examine, like, oh, well, my children are safe here, and I see children who aren't safe. Okay, that's super valid. And having guilt about that and holding that is not actually going to help you take any kind of action.
Exactly. It's that, I think that the guilt leads to so much inaction.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is that what we need to do is be in community. And I think guilt is another one of those pieces that can be really isolating, right? It's oftentimes this like individual experience. And so one of my biggest things about all of this is, how can we get ourselves into a place where we can foster connections with other people and also lean on anyone else that we need to when we need to, and respond in community. Because a lot of the sort of not listening to ourselves, when that happens, can be isolating. And when we can respond in connection with other people, it's all the more powerful, and it helps us get our needs met, which then helps us meet the needs of others and helps us all take action that really moves us toward actual change.
Yeah. And because so much of the guilt comes from this place of, I'm not doing enough.
Right, which is very I-centric.
Yeah. And well, the truth is that you can't do that much alone.
You
and
are
it's
one
true.
human. You are correct.
So, it's about finding those groups and knowing that this is not all yours to carry. This is all of ours to carry.
Exactly. I think that's the number one thing I would want people to know and feel, is that if you ever catch yourself within a social justice movement thinking I, what happens when you shift it to we, and really thinking about how that shifts the perspective that you're looking at. I think another emotion that is really great to be curious about is anger.
Yeah.
Because what we know about anger is that it's oftentimes something that is not valued in society. It's not allowed. Oftentimes, you can't, there's not like a good way to show your anger.
Especially for women identifying folks.
Totally. And people of color.
Yeah.
It's like, it's always, associated with them, and it's always bad, and it's never productive. And that's kind of like the narrative. I think we should be absolutely flipping that on its head. I think anger can be incredibly useful and incredibly productive and absolutely channeled for good and for change. And again, is one of those things that if we're feeling it and we're not releasing it, it's gonna be there. There's all these times when it's like, well, just don't do that. I mean, that's not how emotions work.
Yeah.
They're there. We can't wish them away.
And often when we do hold it, we end up channeling that anger towards ourselves.
Absolutely. Or also misdirecting it at other people, right? When we could be directing it at the system itself or at folks making the decisions and positions of power. And that's actually one of the divide and conquer tactics, is having people fight amongst each other, fight amongst themselves, rather than be able to collectively direct that anger, which is extremely valid and a really normal response to oppression, at the oppressors.
Yeah.
That's exactly what we need to be doing. So I wanted to share an Audre Lorde quote that I really like about anger that I think kind of helps explain that. And this is from an entire speech she actually gave about the uses of anger. And I definitely recommend that anyone who's interested look up that whole speech, because it's beautiful. And I think it's a really amazing way to conceptualize this idea and to help us think about how to really recognize anger as valid and as useful and as something that we can channel. So this is from Audre Lorde's 1981 speech, The Uses of Anger, Women Responding to Racism. And she gave this speech at a keynote presentation at the National Women's Studies Association conference. So she says, "Anger expressed and translated into action in the service of our vision and our future is a liberating and strengthening act of clarification." And I think, that's just one piece of a really amazing speech. But I think for me, that's a lovely way to think about how to channel anger, and the idea of it being in service of a vision is really going to that idea of strategizing, that we're doing it intentionally and that we're doing it in a way that really makes a lot of sense. And I think that's one of those pieces. Anger gets associated with not thinking logically. And that's also one of those really historically long narratives of women and people of color, not being logical, the white men and all the things.
Yeah.
And I think it's really beautiful to consider something like anger, which oftentimes gets thought of as illogical, and how it can be used in a logical and thoughtful and intentional way toward change. And it can actually clarify things rather than make them murkier.
Anger is a very energizing emotion.
Totally. So I think as we talk about these different emotional reactions, right, a lot of that is both allowing ourselves to feel what we need to feel and not being afraid of emotions that maybe have been labeled in a certain way as dangerous, when we know that historically that also comes from a place of oppression, and learning how we can both accept and feel our emotions when we need to in situations like this, and also utilize them and move them in ways that can actually join together to create system change and channel them in the right direction. And so I guess we really want to highlight and put forward the conversation, because oftentimes people aren't comfortable talking about emotions in the first place.
Yeah.
And obviously we're two social workers, so we might be more comfortable with that. But I think it has to be central to this conversation, because it is the elephant in the room. Everyone is having feelings about everything that is happening right now. And I think that knowing what to do with them and how to use them for change is extremely powerful.
And remembering that it's not something that you're just going to work through once, that this is sort of a thing that we do multiple times.
All the time.
All the time, over and over. Feelings are complicated. It's okay.
And grief is not a linear process. It's a cyclical process, like many things. And you can go in and out and back and forth and upside down. And as we go through this and see what happens, yes, expecting that you will have unexpected emotions and feelings. And again, the danger comes doing that in isolation, and the power and strength comes in being able to lean on others and be leaned on by others and share together so that you're able to do that in connection. Because that's how we heal, is in connection.
From dry desert ground, from the grand coulee dam where waters run down, every state of this union, migrants have been. We come with the dust, and we're gone with the wind.
So another thing we wanted to talk about and address in this episode is that what's happening right now isn't new, and that we've been seeing these patterns for a long time. We didn't get here overnight. And so I've been doing this work for about 8 years, like I said earlier, and in that time, there's been an increasing criminalization of the immigrant, and an increasing criminalization of individuals who are seeking political asylum.
Yeah.
And in all of that time, detention centers have existed with conditions that are not great.
Yes. And I would argue that detention itself cannot have conditions that are acceptable in any case. But I agree that they've also been like subpar for all of the time they've existed.
And, you know, I'm from El Paso, which is right on the border. And growing up, the relationship between El Paso and Ciudad Juarez has always been very fluid. People were coming and going. You didn't need a passport to go in until the 2000s.
Yeah, that's so crazy to think about, right?
Yeah, and I sometimes forget because now, and then that's the other point, is that these things become normalized.
Right.
Even as somebody who grew up, my father's an immigration attorney. I've been going with him to like court since I was a little kid. I used to go in and out of Juarez without any ID as a child.
Yeah.
And it's been this slow process over time, you know. First it was we need passports. Then more fencing came up. Then they added more border patrol, and the border patrol started carrying these like crazy arms.
Yeah.
And it's changed the whole landscape of El Paso.
Yeah.
And ICE didn't exist before 2003.
I know. I think, let's repeat that.
Yeah.
ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, did not exist before 2003. I think that a lot of people don't think about it that way when they hear abolish ICE as a chant or as a slogan or as a goal.
Yeah.
Because with enforcement, right? It always feels like, oh, well, it's the law and it's officials and it's this thing that has to be there. But especially when it's such a new thing, I think that maybe helps people to conceptualize, oh, it wasn't that long ago when that didn't even exist as a concept or as a structure for enforcement.
Yeah, and basically these laws changed from like sort of like a civil issue until a federal offense. And so growing up, you would hear stories of people like coming in and getting deported and coming back.
Right.
That's changed as well. Now we have something called illegal reentry. So basically once you've been deported, you can't come back in. And if you do come back in, you're going to get jail time.
Right. Absolutely.
And so the punishments are much harsher now than they used to be.
Even for asylum seekers, the bar is set higher if you've ever come here before, regardless of how strong your claim is around persecution of the country that you're coming from. And I think that's the other piece, right, that is really important for us to talk about is the danger of the criminalization of asylum seekers in particular, right?
Yeah, so the reason that we have the asylum laws that we have is a direct outcome of World War II and the Holocaust.
Right.
Everybody got together and decided that this is not going to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been slowly chipping away at that. And some of the laws in and of themselves are outdated.
Sure.
And need to be updated, but now we're not even following them
Right.
for the most part. I hear stories about folks who come in, and we're going to say this twice too, that political asylum is legal.
Yes. Seeking political asylum is legal. It is a right that all people have.
The work I started with was political asylum work. I'm not an attorney, but I was working for a nonprofit that did exclusively political asylum, and so I learned some things in that time, and I've seen some changes in that time. But one of the changes now is that we are actively discouraging people from coming in.
Yes.
And I've heard stories of people who have gone to the bridge and have claimed fear, and CBP officers are like outright telling them that they're not going to win their case.
Wow.
Which is illegal.
Right.
And they don't know.
Right.
They're not going to get punished. I think that there's a culture of actually condoning that behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we've seen even more in the news, right, around the culture in CBP and how really horrific some of the things that they're willing to say.
Yeah, it's a racist institution.
Absolutely, from its inception. I mean, even just metering, right? Like, even what we've seen with having folks wait on the Mexico side, knowing what increased risk that places them in just with all of the different actors that can definitely take advantage of folks that have to have a guide to get here, who oftentimes have children, who oftentimes are at the end of their resources financially because it is really expensive to come here.
Yeah.
And oftentimes are part of groups that are more highly victimized, that are more likely to be exploited in terms of all kinds of different forms of violence. And we know that in the research. And so I think that when we see that a group that, even if we can start from the basis of migration is a human right, we'll start there. But especially when we see that a group that is supposed to be globally, universally protected, like asylum seekers, when we see the criminalization of that particular group and the specific targeting of that particular group and the specific detention in extremely inhumane conditions of that particular group, that is a warning sign. Because more than a lot of other groups, they're also supposed to be protected. And so I think that also tells us just how far the criminalization of migration has gotten.
Yeah, and how it's been legalized.
Exactly.
This isn't
institutionalized.
Rogue. It's institutionalized. Another thing that I think is worth mentioning is that part of the reason that criminalizing asylum seekers is so scary is because this is a violation of due process. And once that happens to one group, it can happen to other groups.
Absolutely.
And so this like erosion of due process and the using of laws to criminalize individuals, that can happen to us.
Absolutely. And we've even seen over time, right, that folks that were in categories that seemed more protected in the past, like folks with DACA, folks with green cards, temporary protective status, that they're, as you said, chipping away at a lot of protections that have existed. And I think that it is a really stark reminder of where this can lead and what road, if we keep following, we can go down. And knowing that as soon as the rights of some are lost, that holds immense implications for the rights of everyone else. And I think that that's the piece around who this directly impacts or not. I think there's a little bit of an illusion around that, right? The idea that this only directly impacts some people, when really, when we dehumanize people, it impacts everyone.
Yeah. And again, this has been going on for a while. And so, of course, there's a push to close the camps. That's important and has significant repercussions for all sorts of people. But we can't stop there.
Right.
That's a first step.
Absolutely.
All of these other things are part of that battle.
Yes. The detention pieces, especially around for-profit prisons, the way that they literally write legislation that gets proposed around the country, and the way that they hold a lack of transparency, a lack of regulation, the internal reporting around sexual abuse so we don't know about them, the deaths in detention, the conditions, all of that is horrific. And like you're saying, that's a piece of the system that is dehumanizing people. And so it's a place that I think is really important for us to be doing work around. And when we can understand it in the broader context of how they're allowed to exist, and also that if we weren't criminalizing people in the first place, and we can look at the laws that do that, then they wouldn't need to exist regardless. Because the idea of detaining people, especially detaining asylum seekers, that's not required
At all.
That's not something that we have to do. It's something that the U.S. government has decided to do. And they put it in place with the excuse that it would be a deterrent. And what we absolutely know with data is that it has never worked as a deterrent. And I think that's one of those pieces that we have to hold, right? Is that it doesn't function the way they say it's going to. It is dehumanizing. And it's also putting a lot of money in the pocket of private prison owners and private prison companies. So I think as we're looking at this, knowing that ICE hasn't existed that long, knowing that the private prison system is really based on lawmakers allowing them to buy them out, we can see avenues for action. We can see where we might start to find the places for interventions, the places where people can take action. And that's what we're going to talk about next. But I think we wanted to maybe clarify a few other misconceptions just because they're so rampant nowadays that I think it's really important for us to be able to bring in some accuracy information. So one of the things that we wanted to clarify that has been really confusing for folks, I think, is what it means for there to be a detention center or a camp or a shelter. Or all these words are getting tossed around, right? So the first clarification is that adults and families are actually detained through an entirely different system than unaccompanied minors. So unaccompanied minors go through the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which pays shelters to hold them while they try to find family members for them to stay with. And the distinction between that type of shelter and any other is that these unaccompanied minors aren't allowed to leave. So it's absolutely parallel to what happens in the detention system for adults and for families, but it is slightly different because it's nonprofits running it instead of for-profit prisons the majority of the time. And we won't get into all the many complications because there's just so many, but that's one difference that I think is really important to talk about. And there's definitely been huge discrepancies in the level of care and in the conditions for unaccompanied minors being held in this system. That's one piece. The other piece is that there are holding facilities, which are detention centers at the border, called hieleras and perreras. The hieleras are called ice boxes because they're kept really cold. And the perreras means dog cage because there's often a lot of internal fencing and caging. And oftentimes, those are the facilities you've seen in pictures before. Usually, from the experience I've had in talking to folks, they're kept there from anywhere from like 2 to 3 days each in each one. And that might actually be one of the places in which families are first separated. I think it's important to note that there's a lot of ways in which our migration system separates families. Folks have to decide who they can even bring financially in the first place, and that's an initial separation. But in the hieleras and perreras, they might be separating fathers from women and children. Those are kind of where that might be happening.
Can you, when you say these hieleras are cold,
Yes.
Can you expound on that a little bit more
Sure.
for folks who may not know?
So I don't actually know specifically at what temperature they're kept at, but people who have been in them talk about them feeling like they're freezing. And I think it's important also to know that a lot of migrants are coming from countries that are a lot warmer. And so it's an additional shock to the system when you live in a more tropical climate to go into what feels like a refrigerator and be detained there for several days. Most of the time they're sleeping on the floor. This is where you see the foil blankets. Yeah. And they also describe the food as being frozen. So they'll get a ham sandwich or something and it'll be frozen. And so it's those kinds of conditions that have created this term of the icebox. So after they're held in these holding facilities, oftentimes, even though we're detaining the most people we have in a very long time in immigration custody, there's not enough beds for everyone. And so they make these really seemingly arbitrary decisions about who gets detained and who does not. And when I've gone and taken social workers to the border, the folks that we work with have been in hieleras and perreras, but there wasn't space for them in a family detention center. And this also points to why we don't have to be detaining folks, because not everyone is detained after that. And they're actually released to a local shelter. And this is why it's confusing, because I just said there were shelters under ORR for unaccompanied minors. In this other system for adults and for families, the shelters are run by folks like Catholic Charities at the border, and the families aren't detained there. They're released there by CBP, and the folks at those shelters will actually help them get a bus ticket to go stay with their family. So oftentimes people will stay there and will seek help there because it's a way to get connected, and they have these systems in place, and they need all kinds of donations and help. But it's very different from being forced to stay in a place and not being able to leave. Yeah. So I think that's a really huge distinction.
And the people who are working and...
Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. And a lot of these are volunteers that are doing really, really hard work day in and day out. And when people have been told that they can't donate supplies, they're talking about actual detention facilities or shelters that are being paid by the government to hold migrants. The shelters that operate outside of that, like Catholic Charities and Annunciation House, they can absolutely accept supplies and donations and volunteers. And they are doing a lot of the important work, very much less funded than other folks, because they're getting, when we went there, they were getting 300 to 400 folks dropped off per day. Yeah. So it's a huge amount. So I think that is maybe hopefully a helpful clarification for people who want to contribute or want to help and want to be able to know who they're supporting.
Yeah, and we're about to go into our next segment, which is going to be some really tangible things that people can do to help. But one of the things I want to say before that is that, yes, this has been happening for a long time, and those of us who have been working on this issue have been seeing the writing on the wall for a while. But these detention centers and the conditions that we're currently seeing them at is what has gotten so much outrage and so much attention to the issue. And so now that you're here and you're listening and you want to help, I urge you to stay the course, that it isn't enough to close the camps, that we've got to go a step further, because it's not just about the inhumanity or the abuses of human right, which are egregious and we are against, obviously, but it's about our own safety as a society.
Yeah, and making sure that we can address any system of oppression, which we know are extremely intersectional in how they abuse their power. And so that by looking at the systems that enable these human rights abuses and how we can change or completely take away those systems, we are going to be addressing broader issues that are extremely important to everyone who lives in this country as a whole and in other countries as well.
When did you come to America? Long, long before, when the buffalo walked. When did your hands burn like gold? The thing that made this land your pride and your joy. When did you come to America? I came to help you grow, to harvest your crops. I came to build your roads, your cities and your thoughts. You say you don't need me, but you know what you've got.
So we really wanted to talk about some more specific ideas and strategies for taking action, because sometimes that's missing with this broader narrative of like do what you can, help. And it's really great to hear, you should check in with your own capacity and your energy and your time and do this with other people. But that can still sound really abstract. So given that you should absolutely do that first, we want to talk about some specific ideas. So the first one is a little bigger picture, but is super important. So if we can't imagine or think of the change that we want to see or how things would be different if we made change, then we're never going to get there. We have to be able to believe in it in order to set tangible goals, in order to set steps toward those goals, just like anything we ever want to accomplish in life. And so we can use an idea like abolish ICE as an example. If we can understand it, like it was not created till 2003 and how it functions, and that it is a federal piece, so we probably can't go to the Texas legislature and ask them to abolish ICE because it would be a federal issue. The more we understand it, the more we can think through, okay, with the goal being abolish ICE, what are tangible steps? Who do we need to move on this issue? Who can I write to? How can we band together in groups to both protest and work within kind of the legal system to make this happen? Mm-hmm. So taking a seemingly big issue or a big idea and making it really concrete, and then taking the steps that you personally can take to get there.
Yeah, and remember that none of these are natural laws.
Right.
This isn't gravity. These are man-made laws that that can be changed.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's the first piece.
Mm-hmm. And another thing you can do is write letters to your representatives and senators.
And I think it's really important if you are a mental health professional or student listening to this podcast that you have such an important perspective. I think I'm always trying to get the mental health perspective of how this issue relates to trauma and how this issue relates to isolation and human rights abuses in terms of mental health. And so if you have experience in the mental health field, and especially if you've also worked with immigrant clients, know that your perspective is extremely important and extremely needed, and use that when you write those letters. And a second piece around that is that there's always mental health professionals needed to write letters for immigration cases. And that's actually something that I'm going to plug real quick, a new initiative that I'm starting as part of my work with Girasol, because we are going to be coordinating professionals who have licensures in the mental health fields beyond social work in the Austin and San Antonio areas to write letters of support for cases. And we're also connected to a group doing this in Houston. And so if you have an interest in being trained in order to write letters, in being part of a really coordinated system that is going to give you templates and ideas and mentorship and consultation around doing those letters, I will put some information in the notes and on our website and on our Facebook page about how you can get in touch with me to be a part of that pilot project that we're going to be launching in the next few months, so that we can make sure that we're able to meet the needs of lawyers who oftentimes need to be able to show psychological damage and why that's just as damaging as physical violence. And so you have an important role to play, and I would love to hear from you to get you involved.
And my understanding is that these mental health professionals do not have to be bilingual.
Right. So oftentimes we think of immigrants as being and asylum seekers as being Spanish speaking, but they actually come from a lot of different countries. And so there's a lot of cases with indigenous languages and other languages where we do need interpreters. And obviously, if you are bilingual in any language, including Spanish, all the more reason to please add your contribution to this work. But you can absolutely do this without speaking a second language and using an interpreter.
So Anna's going to put that information out, and you can email us. Another thing you can do is donate money. And I think this is one that people sometimes don't think has a big impact because it's not like a direct action, but it's huge.
And it is a direct action.
Yeah.
Like, you hear the expression money talks, right?
Yeah, and it really, really, really does. If you have the means to donate, it is so needed, and it can go so far.
And there's a lot of also structural institutional reasons that a lot of this work is unfunded or not funded well enough. And so you're also helping to adjust for that injustice by donating when you can, if you can.
If you can. Mm-hmm.
I think another piece that is so important and that we just did on the 4th of July at the Austin Capitol building is going to protests and helping plan protests. I think maybe people don't realize that anyone can plan a protest.
Yeah. Anybody.
Anyone can plan a protest.
Even you.
Even you can plan a protest. Like, I think that it maybe feels like this big thing. And I think with everything here, it's like obviously within your skill set, within your capacity, within your energy and your time, all the things. But just really helping all of us have more confidence that we are capable of doing really great things. And so a protest doesn't have to be thousands of people, though I'm really proud that it was. I mean, it can be 10 people. Absolutely. With
You're saying
signs.
the one here in Austin.
Yes, the one here in Austin. We can absolutely have all different size protests, and all of them matter. And going to protests is really important, and really making sure that you're visible. Because I think a lot of the times, especially with the issue of detention, is that when it's not in the media like this, it isn't visible. So I appreciate that protests are happening right now, but I would love to see one in like September.
Yeah.
When, if this news has died down by then, to keep it visible. We cannot underestimate the power of protest and the power of coming together and being in the media and being seen and having politicians really be able to know how many people care about this issue. It's one of the biggest ways to have a visual representation of that. And I think a really important caveat is that there are some policies that ICE tends to have around going into protests. And if protests become, as they perceive them, quote unquote, violent, and we could have a long conversation about the issues around the use of that word and what that means, they actually tend to be able to go into protests after that. And so if you're planning something, just bearing in mind, if it's around immigration and you want undocumented folks to be able to participate, please be extra mindful of the safety of the protest and the way that you're kind of moving through and acting, because it really can make a difference. And it would be ironic and awful if you got folks deported from a protest supporting immigration.
And something I want to add is that I actually don't go to very many protests because of my autoimmune condition. It's just very draining on my body. And here we have some pretty extreme heat. So I don't tend to go anymore, and I've had some guilt around that I've had to work through. But I wanted to add that because not everybody has to do everything.
Yes.
And in my sort of trajectory, the amount of work I'm able to do has changed, and that's normal and natural. And, you know, some of the things I used to do that took like physical energy, I'm not able to do anymore, but I'm older now as well and more experienced.
Ancient and wise.
I'm ancient and wise now, and I have that. I can give in other ways, and it's just as valid.
Yes. I think that cannot be understated, that everyone's contribution is valid, and that part of the idea of thinking through your capacity and your energy and your time is literally to say, am I going to the protest or not? And that it's completely okay for the answer to be no. And that's true of donating if you need to pay rent and that's going to eat all the money, because we've been there. And
Been there.
been there, done that.
There right now. But okay.
Yeah, many moons ago. No. And that any of these pieces, going and volunteering your time, being able, you know, to drive past a checkpoint, to go to a detention center, to be able to help, right? Like, we all have different limitations, and we all have different skills and strengths. And when you are harnessing your own skills and strengths and within your energy and capacity, then you're doing the work. And what you need to know, and part of the power of doing this in community, is that Ale and I each know what we're each doing, and we each know what a bunch of other people are doing. And if that guilt feeling starts to creep in, you're like, oh no, but I'm doing this piece, and someone else is doing that other piece. And they're both needed, and they're both valid. And if we were both doing the same thing, the other pieces wouldn't get done. And that's what's important.
Yeah, and if you're pushing way past your capacity, you're not going to be able to do this work long term, and we need you long term.
We need everybody long term, because takes a long time to make system change, true system change. And a lot of the work is not glorious or out in public, or it's a lot of making copies and flyering and stapling and getting people water and doing a lot of things that need to be done over time to eventually make big change.
So another thing that can be donated are supplies and time. And some of the places you can go to donate your supplies and time and sandwich making skills often are folks like the Angry Tias out in South Texas, Catholic Charities, Annunciation House. And I also suggest that you do a little bit of research in your own community and what people are doing locally, because that's where you can have the most impact.
And oftentimes these folks will have wish lists. If you look them up on Facebook, the Angry Tias y Abuelas RGV has a really awesome Facebook page. So
Rio Grande Valley.
Yes, Rio Grande Valley has a really awesome Facebook page. And most of the time what you'll see is that they'll have a wish list, and you can actually pay for donations to be sent directly to them. And that is invaluable because there's just so many people who need support. And when they have enough supplies, they're able to take care of everyone's needs in such a different way.
Yeah. And folks like Annunciation House, if you follow them, their social media, they'll let you know what they need. And I mean, honestly, like often what they need is people to come over and make peanut butter sandwiches.
Absolutely.
Like 300 at a time.
Right.
So,
which is really, really important.
Yeah.
And in Austin, if you're in Austin, Casa Marianela currently needs a lot of donations. They also have asylum seekers that stay with them, and they're a great example of what an alternative to detention can look like. A different, more supportive system with case management and really integrated into the community.
Yeah.
And so if you can help out with any kind of donations, I know they're looking for HEB gift cards. I know Casa Marianela is in need of support right now, especially.
Yeah, and they've been doing this work for a long time.
Yes. And if you're listening and you're a service provider and you work directly with clients or children or anyone, and that includes teachers, that includes anyone. Kind of professional who works with folks, one of the simplest and most powerful things you can do is let them know that you're an ally. And one of the ways you can do that, and United We Dream has a great collection of these, is by printing ally posters or ordering ally signs or buttons. And it really will say something like, I'm so-and-so and I'm an ally for undocumented students, or things like that for teachers, right? And when you have that in your office, when you have that on your door, when you have that in your agency, and folks come in seeking services or come in for class, it makes a difference. It lets them know that you're plugged in, that you're in tune with what's happening, that you're making a really public stance of support. And I think that that's really powerful for people to feel a little bit more at ease and a little bit more comfortable. I also encourage you, with United We Dream and other folks have created Know Your Rights cards. And when you're a teacher or a service provider, you may be put in a position at some point where ICE might come looking for someone. And when you have read about Know Your Rights and you know that, for example, it has to be signed by a judge, it needs to have the spelling of someone's name exactly perfectly, all of those pieces, then you can put your allyship into action and actually be able to make sure that we're keeping people safe. That also leads into the idea of deportation defense. I know that grassroots leadership in Austin has ICE out of Austin, and they do specific deportation defense. And with all the news about raids around now, which has coincided with all of the news around detention, I think it's really important, if you have the capacity and if this is within your role, to be up to date on what community members are saying around deportation defense, because it has literally stopped deportations in the past to have allies involved.
So just like educating yourself on knowing your rights and your clients' rights, there are other ways that you can educate yourself. And one of those ways is to consume valid news sources. There's a lot of fake news out there.
Really?
Yeah, a lot.
You don't say.
Very sad. But so a few of these sources are MALDEF, United We Dream, the Texas Observer, Mother Jones. Yeah, notice who people are citing and where they're getting their information from. That's really important. And I personally really like the Texas Observer and Mother Jones because they do long form, which, you know, we're all busy. Sometimes it can take a while
Reading.
Yeah, I know, reading's hard. But I've gotten so much information out of their articles. Also, ProPublica.
Yes,
Another good place to go.
That is another good place. And MALDEF and United We Dream we also included because I think they're good at giving kind of briefer updates. So MALDEF will summarize legislative changes or Supreme Court decisions or things like that. And they oftentimes will release the information in both English and Spanish. And so if you're working with folks who just speak Spanish, you can have a really easy way to make sure that they have access to information as well. Because a lot of this is not just being informed, but making sure that we're not being gatekeepers for information also. So as much as we can be transparent in that process, I think it's going to be really helpful. But I always would just say, don't speak to what you don't know, because it's really, literally can put people in danger. And speaking of which, another thing that's been shared a lot that is really important is around ICE raids, because that has come up. It can get really tricky when people share on social media information about ICE raids that isn't accurate.
Yeah.
And so, again, don't share if you're not sure 100% that what you're sharing is accurate information, because that can spread fear in a really harmful way. And if you are a service provider who does any kind of home visiting and you know that the people that you're working with are dealing with an ICE raid and you have the ability to do something like bring groceries to their home so they don't have to leave, things like that are invaluable and are part potentially of your job and are something that are a contribution to this work. And so I think, again, we started with big picture ideas and now we're getting down to these smaller, really tangible acts. And I think it's the idea that we bring all of those pieces together, and that's what really moves the needle on a broader level.
And finally, if you have any sort of creative skill, that is super useful as well. So if you're a musician or a writer or an artist or an actor even.
A podcaster.
The artwork that remains from past social movements is some of the most inspiring and helpful, at least to me at this time. And so we can be part of creating what gets left behind for the future.
I love that.
Thanks.
And I think, again, when we say assess, your time and your skills and your energy, every single thing that we can do to contribute can be powerful and can be helpful. And I think there's another thing about creativity that is really, really uniquely human. And it brings out the most human in a lot of us. And when we're dealing with a situation that is specifically dehumanizing as part of oppression, if we can combat that with things that are inherently humanizing, like music and like writing and any other form of creativity, painting, then that's another form of resistance that is extremely important in the midst of all of this. So at the end of the day, we really want you to consider what you can do long term, not just short term. And in order to do that, we were thinking about what it takes in terms of flexibility. Because one of the things about this oppressive system of immigration is that it comes at us every which way. It creates crisis on purpose, which we know then hijacks the logical thinking part of our brain. And so if we can actually be grounded and if we can take care of ourselves and drink water and sleep and really bolster our energy and be in community, then that in and of itself is resisting the crisis feeling that is being thrust upon us by the system of oppression. And when we do that, we can be more flexible. So if we think about a branch that is holding an immense amount of weight, if the branch is brittle and inflexible, the more weight that comes on it, the quicker it snaps. But if we have a flexible branch that is holding immense weight in this case of the oppressive immigration system, it can stretch and it can bend, but it won't break. And then it can bounce back even stronger. And so I think we really wanted to end with this metaphor of thinking of each of ourselves individually and also all of us together in community as that branch that is flexible, that can bounce, that can bend, but that will not break, because we are going to bring all of our energy together and we are going to be flexible with all of the changes that come. And we're going to keep at this for a long enough time that we can bend back, we can bounce back, and we can throw off the weight of oppression that is on us in terms of this issue.
Mm-hmm. So we hope that this episode has been helpful, and we encourage you to act in any way that you can. And just remember that there is no human being who doesn't have something to give. So you have something to give, and we ask you to give it.
And there's no human being that is not deserving of rights, including
Exactly.
you and everyone else and every immigrant that has ever sought safety or opportunity or family. And we invite you to hold on to that humanity and the rights that you deserve and that everyone deserves as you think about taking action. And we invite you to take your first step by connecting with others. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Latinx Mental Health Podcast. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at LatinxMHPod, find us on Facebook and YouTube, and subscribe everywhere you listen to podcasts.
Hasta la próxima!